A boy and a fox and a crow and two squirrels and a newborn lamb are coming to see me this morning. I want them brought upstairs as soon as they come. You are not to begin playing with the animals in the servants' hall and keep them there. I want them here." The nurse gave a slight gasp and tried to conceal it with a cough. "Yes, sir," she answered. "I'll tell you what you can do," added Colin, waving his hand. "You can tell Martha to bring them here. The boy is Martha's brother. His name is Dickon, and he is an animal charmer." "I hope the animals won't bite, Master Colin," said the nurse. "I told you he was a charmer. Charmers' animals never bite." "There are snake charmers in India," said Mary, "and they can put their snakes' heads in their mouths." "Goodness!" shuddered the nurse. They ate their breakfast with the morning air pouring in on them. Colin's breakfast was a very good one, and Mary watched him with serious interest. "You will begin to get fatter just as I did. I never wanted my breakfast when I was in India, and now I always want it." "I wanted mine this morning," said Colin. "Perhaps it was the fresh air. When do you think Dickon will come?" He was not long in coming. In about 10 minutes, Mary held up her hand. "Listen, did you hear a caw?" Colin listened and heard it, the oddest sound in the world to hear inside the house. A hoarse caw, caw. "Yes," he answered. "That's Soot," said Mary. "Listen again. Do you hear a bleat, a tiny one?" "Oh, yes," cried Colin, quite flushing. "That's the newborn lamb," said Mary. "He's coming." Dickon's moorland boots were thick and clumsy, and though he tried to walk quietly, they made a clumping sound as he walked through the long corridors. Mary and Colin heard him marching, marching, until he passed through the tapestry door on to the soft carpet of Colin's own passage. "If you please, sir," announced Martha, opening the door. "If you please, sir, here's Dickon and his creatures." Dickon came in smiling his nicest wide smile. The newborn lamb was in his arms, and the little red fox trotted by his side. Nut sat on his left shoulder, and Soot on his right, and Shell's head and paws peeped out of his coat pocket. Colin slowly sat up and stared, as he had stared when he first saw Mary. But this was a stare of wonder and delight. The truth was that, in spite of all he had heard, he had not in the least understood what this boy would be like, and that his fox and his crow and his squirrels and his lamb were so near to him, and his friendliness, that they seemed almost to be a part of himself. Colin had never talked to a boy in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by his own pleasure and curiosity that he did not even think of speaking. But Dickon did not feel the least shy or awkward. He had not felt embarrassed because the crow had not known his language and had only stared and had not spoken to him the first time they met. Creatures were always like that until you found out about you. He walked over to Colin's sofa and put the newborn lamb quietly on his lap. And immediately the little creature turned to the warm velvet dressing gown and began to nuzzle and nuzzle into its folds and butt its tight-curled head with soft impatience against his side. Of course, no boy could have helped speaking then. "What is it doing?" cried Colin. "What does it want?" "It wants its mother," said Dickon, smiling more and more. "I brought it to thee a wee bit hungry because I knowed thou'd like to see it feed." He knelt down by the sofa and took a feeding bottle from his pocket. "Come on, little un," he said, turning the small woolly white head with a gentle brown hand. "This is what thou's after. Thou'll get more out of this than thou will out of silk velvet coats. There now." And he pushed the rubber tip of the bottle into the nuzzling mouth, and the lamb began to suck it with ecstasy. After that, there was no wondering what to say. By the time the lamb fell asleep, questions poured forth, and Dickon answered them all. He told them how he had found the lamb just as the sun was rising 3 mornings ago. He had been standing on the moor listening to a skylark and watching him swing higher and higher into the sky until he was only a speck in the heights of blue. "I'd almost lost him but for his song, and I was wondering how a chap could hear it, when he seemed he would get out of the world in just a minute. And then I heard something else far off among the gorse bushes. It was a weak bleatin', and I knowed it was a new lamb as was hungry, and I knowed it wouldn't be hungry if it hadn't lost its mother somehow, so I set off searchin'. I did have a look for it. I went in and out among the gorse bushes and round, and I always seemed to take the wrong turnin'. But at last I seed a bit of white by the rock on top of the moor, and I climbed up and found the little un half dead with cold and clemmin'. While he talked, Soot flew solemnly in and out of the open window and cawed remarks about the scenery while Nut and Shell made excursions into the big trees outside and ran up and down trunks and explored branches. Captain curled up near Dickon, who sat on the hearthrug from preference. They looked at the pictures in the gardening books, and Dickon knew all the flowers by their country names and knew exactly which ones were already growing in the secret garden. I couldn't say their name, he said, pointing to the one under which was written Aquilega, but us calls that columbine. And that one there's a snapdragon, and they both grow wild in hedges, but these is garden ones, and they're bigger and grander. There's some big clumps of columbine in the garden. They'll look like a bed of blue and white butterflies fluttering when they're out. I am going to see them, cried Colin. I am going to see them. Aye, that thou mun, said Mary quite seriously, and thou munnot lose no time about it. Chapter 20. I shall live forever and ever and ever. They were obliged to wait more than a week because first there came some very windy days, and then Colin was threatened with a cold, which, two things happening one after the other, would no doubt have thrown him into a rage, but that there was so much careful and mysterious planning to do, and almost every day Dickon came in, if only for a few minutes, to talk about what was happening on the moor and in the lanes and hedges, on the borders of streams. The things he had to tell about otters and badgers and water rats' houses, not to mention birds' nests and field mice and their burrows, were enough to make you almost tremble with excitement when you heard all the intimate details from an animal charmer and realized with what thrilling eagerness and anxiety the whole busy underworld was working. They're the same as us, said Dickon, only they have to build their homes every year, and it keeps them so busy they fair scuffle to get 'em done. The most absorbing thing, however, was the preparations to be made before Colin could be transported with sufficient secrecy to the garden. No one must see the chair, carriage, and Dickon and Mary after they turned a certain corner of the shrubbery and entered upon the walk outside the ivied walls. As each day passed, Colin had become more and more fixed in his feeling that the mystery surrounding the garden was one of its greatest charms. Nothing must spoil that. No one must ever suspect that they had a secret. People must think that he was simply going out with Mary and Dickon because he liked them and did not object to their looking at him. They had long and quiet, delightful talks about their route. They would go up this path and down that one, cross the other, and go round among the fountain flower beds, as if they were looking at the bedding out plants, the head gardener, Mr. Roach, having been arranged. That would seem such a rational thing to do that no one would think it at all mysterious. They would turn into the shrubbery walks and lose themselves until they came to the long walls. It was almost as serious and elaborately thought out as the plans of march made by great generals in time of war. Rumors of the new and curious things which were occurring in the invalids' apartments had of course filtered through the servants' hall into the stable yards and out among the gardeners. But notwithstanding this, Mr. Roach was startled one day when he received orders from Master Colin's room to the effect that he must report himself in the apartment no outsider had ever seen, as the invalid himself desired to speak with him. Well, well, he said to himself as he hurriedly changed his coat, what's to do now? His Royal Highness that wasn't to be looked at, calling up a man he's never set eyes on. Mr. Roach was not without curiosity. He had never even caught a glimpse of the boy and had heard a dozen exaggerated stories about his uncanny looks and ways and his insane tempers. The thing he had heard oftenest was that he might die at any moment, and there had been numerous fanciful descriptions of a humped back and helpless limbs given by people who had never seen him. Oh, the logs are trying to send me a message. I need more. Oh, much better. That's a talking fire, though. That's a lot of complaints. Things are changing in this house, Mr. Roach, said Mrs. Medlock, as she led him up the back staircase to the corridor on which opened the hitherto mysterious chamber. Let's hope they're changing for the better, Mrs. Medlock, he answered. They couldn't well change for the worse, she continued. And queer as it all is, there's them as find their duties made a lot easier to stand up under. Don't you be surprised, Mr. Roach, if you find yourself in the middle of a menagerie and Martha Sowerby's Dickon more at home than you or me could ever be. There really was a sort of magic about Dickon, as Mary had always privately believed. When Mr. Roach heard his name, he smiled quite leniently. He'd be at home in Buckingham Palace or at the bottom of a coal mine, he said. And yet it's not impudence either. He's just fine, is that lad. It was perhaps well he had been prepared, or he might have been startled. When the bedroom door was opened, a large crow, which seemed quite at home perched on the high back of a caravan chair, announced the entrance of the visitor by saying, "Caw, caw," quite loudly. In spite of Mrs. Medlock's warning, Mr. Roach only just escaped being sufficiently undignified to jump backward. The young Rajah was neither in bed nor on his sofa. He was sitting in an armchair, and a young lamb was standing by him, shaking its tail in feeding lamb fashion, as Dickon knelt giving it its milk from its bottle. A squirrel was perched on Dickon's bent back, attentively nibbling a nut. The little girl from India was sitting on a big footstool looking on. "Here's Mr. Roach, Master Colin," said Mrs. Medlock. The young Rajah turned and looked at his servitor over. At least that was what the head gardener felt happened. "Oh, you are Roach, are you? I sent for you to give you some very important orders." "Very good, sir," answered Roach, wondering if he was to receive instructions to fell all the oaks in the park or transform the orchards into water gardens. "I am going out in my chair this afternoon. If the fresh air agrees with me, I may go out every day. When I go, none of the gardeners are to be anywhere near the long walk by the garden walls. No one is to be there. I shall go out about 2 o'clock, and everyone must keep away until I send word that they may go back to their work." "Very good, sir," replied Mr. Roach, much relieved to hear that the oaks might remain and that the orchards were safe. "Mary," said Colin, turning to her, "what is that thing you say in India when you finish talking and want people to go?" "You say, 'You have my permission to go,'" answered Mary. The Rajah waved his hand. "You have my permission to go. But remember, this is very important." "Caw, caw," remarked the crow hoarsely, but not impolitely. "Very good, sir. Thank you, sir," said Mr. Roach, and Mrs. Medlock took him out of the room. Outside in the corridor, being a rather good-natured man, he smiled until he almost laughed. "My word, he's got a fine lordly way with him, hasn't he? You'd think he was a whole royal family rolled into one, prince consort and all." "Eh," protested Mrs. Medlock, "we've had to let him trample all over every one of us ever since he had feet. He thinks he's what folks are born for." "Perhaps he'll grow out of it if he lives," suggested Mr. Roach. "Well, there's one thing pretty sure," said Mrs. Medlock. "If he does live and that Indian child stays here, I'll warrant she teaches him that the whole orange does not belong to him, as Susan Sowerby says, and he'll be likely to find out the size of his own quarter." Inside the room, Colin was leaning back on his cushions. "It's all safe now," he said, "and this afternoon I shall see it. This afternoon I shall be in it." Dickon went back to the garden with his creatures, and Mary stayed with Colin. She did not think he looked tired, but he was very quiet before their lunch came, and he was quiet while they were eating it. She wondered why and asked him about it. "What big eyes you've got, Colin. When you are thinking they get big as saucers. What are you thinking about now?" "I can't help thinking what it will look like," he answered. "The garden?" asked Mary. "The springtime. I was thinking that I've never really seen it before. I scarcely ever went out, and when I did go, I never looked at it. I didn't even think about it. I never saw it in India because there wasn't any, said Mary. Shut in and morbid as his life had been, Colin had more imagination than she had, and at least he had spent a good deal of time looking at wonderful books and pictures. That morning when you ran in and said, it's come, you made me feel quite queer. It sounded as if things were coming with a great procession and big bursts and wafts of music. I've a picture like it in one of my books. Crowds of lovely people and children with garlands and branches with blossoms on them. Everyone laughing and dancing and crowding and playing on pipes. That's why I said, perhaps we shall hear golden trumpets, and told you to throw open the window. How funny, said Mary. That's really just what it feels like. And if all the flowers and leaves and green things and birds and wild creatures danced past at once, what a crowd it would be. I'm sure they'd dance and sing and flute, and there would be wafts of music. They both laughed, but it was not because the idea was laughable, but because they both so liked it. A little later, the nurse made Colin ready. She noticed that instead of lying like a log while his clothes were put on, he sat up and made some efforts to help himself, and he talked and laughed with Mary the whole time. This is one of his good days, sir, she said to Dr. Craven, who dropped in to inspect him. He's in such good spirits it makes him stronger. I'll call in again later and in the afternoon after he's come in, said Dr. Craven. I must see how the going out agrees with him. I wish that he would let you go with him. I'd rather give up the case this moment, sir, than even stay here while it's suggested, answered the nurse, with the sudden firmness. I hadn't really decided to suggest it, said the doctor, with his slight nervousness. We'll try the experiment. Dickon's a lad I'd trust with a newborn child. The strongest footman in the house carried Colin downstairs and put him in his wheeled chair, near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushions, the Rajah waved his hand to him and to the nurse. You have my permission to go, he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and it must be confessed they giggled when they were safely inside the house. Dickon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. The arch of it looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like birds floating on outspread wings below its crystal blueness. The wind swept in soft, big breaths down the moor, and it was strange with a wild, clear, scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his thin chest to draw it in, and his big eyes looked as if they were listening instead of his ears. There are so many sounds of singing and humming and calling out. What is that scent the puffs of wind bring? It's the gorse on the moor that's opening out, answered Dickon. The bees are at it wonderful today. Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. In fact, every gardener or gardener's lad had been witched away. But they wound in and out among the shrubbery and out and round the fountain beds, following their carefully planned route for the mere mysterious pleasure of it. But when at last they turned into the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. This is it, breathed Mary. This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder. Is it? Cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. But I can see nothing. There's no door. That's what I thought, said Mary. Then there was a lovely, breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. That is the garden where Ben Weatherstaff works. Is it? Said Colin. A few yards more, and Mary whispered again. This is where the robin flew over the wall. Is it? Cried Colin. Oh, I wish he'd come again. And that, said Mary with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, is where he perched on the little heap of earth and showed me the key. Then Colin sat up. Where? There? He cried, and his eyes were as big as the wolf's in Little Red Riding Hood, when Riding Hood felt called upon to remark on them. Dickon stood still, and the wheeled chair stopped. And this, said Mary, stepping onto the bed close to the ivy, is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall. And this is the ivy the wind blew back, and she took hold of the hanging green curtain. Oh, is it? Is it? Gasped Colin. And here is the handle. And here's the door. Dickon, push him in quickly. And Dickon did it with one strong, steady, splendid push. But Colin had actually dropped back against his cushions, even though he gasped with delight. And he had covered his eyes with his hands and held them there, shutting out everything until they were inside, and the chair stopped as if by magic, and the door was closed. Not till then did he take them away and look round and round and round, as Dickon and Mary had done. And over walls and earth and trees and swinging sprays and tendrils, the fair green veil of tender little leaves had crept, and in the grass under the trees and the gray urns in the alcoves, and here and there and everywhere were touches or splashes of gold, purple, pink, and the trees were showing snow above his head, and there were fluttering of wings and faint, sweet pipes and humming with scents and sounds. That's a hell of a sentence. It's a very long one.
Yeah,
A lot of words. This will give me a moment to poke up the fire a little bit. Hot one. I'm going to pop out for just a moment. it looks like we need to put some more logs on the fire. This one with all this bark, it might get pretty roasty toasty. And it's a triangle. We like the triangle ones. That'll do the trick. There we go. Oh yeah, that's much better. Can't let the fire get too low, because that's not as fun. There we go. Okay, we just finished the longest sentence in the world describing the garden. And the sun fell warm upon his face like a hand with a lovely touch. And in wonder, Mary and Dickens stood and stared at him. He looked so strange and different because a pink glow of color had actually crept all over him, ivory face and neck and hands and all. I shall get well, I shall get well, he cried out. Mary, Dickon, I shall get well, and I shall live forever and ever and ever. Chapter 21, Ben Weatherstaff. One of the strange things about living in the world is that it is only now and then one is quite sure one is going to live forever and ever and ever. One knows it sometimes when one gets up at the tender, solemn dawn time and goes out and stands alone and throws one's head far back and looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing and flushing and marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out and one's heart stands still at the strange, unchanging majesty of the rising of the sun, which has been happening every morning for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so, and one knows it sometimes when one stands by oneself in a wood at sunset, and the mysterious deep gold stillness slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly again and again something one cannot quite hear, however much one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet of the dark blue at night, with millions of stars waiting and watching, makes one sure. And sometimes a sound of far-off music makes it true, and sometimes a look in someone's eyes. And it was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt the springtime inside the 4 high walls of a hidden garden. That afternoon, the whole world seemed to devote itself to being perfect and radiantly beautiful and kind to one boy. Perhaps out of pure heavenly goodness, the spring came and crowned everything it possibly could into that one place. More than once, Dickon paused in what he was doing and stood still with a sort of growing wonder in his eyes, shaking his head softly. It is gradely, he said. I'm 12 going on 13, and there's a lot of afternoons in 13 years, but seems to me like I never seed one as gradely as this year. Aye, it is a gradely one, said Mary, and she sighed for mere joy. I'll warrant it's the gradeliest one as ever was in the world. Does thou think, said Colin with dreamy carefulness, as it happened it was made like this here for all purpose of me? My word, cried Mary admiringly, that there is a bid good o' Yorkshire, th'art shapen first rate, and that th'art. And delight reigned. They drew the chair under the plum tree, which was snow white with blossoms and musical with bees. It was like a king's canopy, a fairy king's. There were flowering cherry trees near, and apple trees whose buds were pink and white, and here and there one had burst open wide. Between the blossoming branches of the canopy, bits of blue sky looked down like wonderful eyes. Mary and Dickon worked a little here and there, and Colin watched them. They brought him things to look at, buds which were opening, buds which were tight closed, bits of twig whose leaves were just showing green, the feather of a woodpecker which had dropped on the grass, the empty shell of some early bird hatched. Dickon pushed the chair slowly round and round the garden, stopping every other moment to let him look at wonders springing out of the earth or trailing down from trees. It was like being taken in state round the country of a magic king and queen, and shown all the mysterious riches it contained. "I wonder if we shall see the robin," said Colin. "Thou'll see him enough after a bit," answered Dickon. "When the eggs hatches out, the little chap, he'll be kept so busy, it'll make his head swim. Thou'll see him flying backward and forward, carrying worms nigh as big as himself, and that much noise going on in the nest when he gets there as fair flusters him, so as he scarce knows which big mouth to drop the first piece in, and gaping beaks and squawks on every side. Mother says as when she sees the work a robin has to keep them gaping beaks filled, she feels like she was a lady with nothing to do. She says she's seen the little chaps when it seemed like the sweat must be dripping off 'em, though folk can't see it." This made them giggle so delightedly that they were obliged to cover their mouths with their hands, remembering that they must not be heard. Colin had been instructed as to the law of whispers and low voices several days before. He liked the mysteriousness of it and did his best, but in the midst of excited enjoyment, it is rather difficult never to laugh above a whisper. Every moment of the afternoon was full of new things, and every hour the sunshine grew more golden. The wheeled chair had been drawn back under the canopy, and Dickon had sat down on the grass and had just drawn out his pipe when Colin saw something he had not had time to notice before. "That's a very old tree over there, isn't it?" he said. Dickon looked across the grass at the tree, and Mary looked, and there was a brief moment of stillness. "Yes," answered Dickon, after it, and his low voice had a very gentle sound. Mary gazed at the tree and thought. "The branches are quite gray, and there's not a single leaf anywhere," Colin went on. "It's quite dead, isn't it?" "Aye," admitted Dickon, "but them roses as have climbed all over it will near hide every bit of the dead wood when they're full of leaves and flowers. It won't look dead then. It'll be the prettiest of all." Mary still gazed at the tree and thought. "It looks as if a big branch had been broken off," said Colin. "I wonder how it was done." "It's been done many a year," answered Dickon, with a sudden relieved start and laying his hand on Colin. "Look at that robin. There he is. He's been foraging for his mate." Colin was almost too late, but he just caught sight of him, the flash of red-breasted bird with something in his beak. He darted through the greenness and into the close-grown corner and was out of sight. Colin leaned back on his cushion again, laughing a little. "He's taking her tea to her. Perhaps it's 5 o'clock. I think I'd like some tea myself." And so they were safe. "It was magic which sent the robin," said Mary secretly to Dickon afterward. "I know it was magic." For both she and Dickon had been afraid Colin might ask something about the tree whose branch had broken off 10 years ago, and they talked it over together. And Dickon had stood and rubbed his head in a troubled way. "We mun look as if it were no different than other trees. We could never tell him how it broke, poor lad. If he says anything about it, we mun try to look cheerful." "Aye, that we mun," had answered Mary. But she had not felt as if she looked cheerful when she gazed at the tree. She wondered and wondered in those few moments if there was any reality in that other thing Dickon had said. He had gone on rubbing his rust-red hair in a puzzled way, but a nice comforted look had begun to grow in his blue eyes. "Mrs. Craven was a very lovely young lady," he had gone on rather hesitatingly. "And Mother, she thinks maybe she's about Misselthwaite many a time looking after Mester Colin, same as all mothers do when they're took out of the world. They have to come back, thou sees. Happen she's been in the garden, and happen it was her set us to work and told us to bring him here." Mary had thought he meant something about magic. She was a great believer in magic. Secretly, she quite believed that Dickon worked magic, of course good magic, on everything near him, and that was why people liked him so much, and wild creatures knew he was their friend. She wondered indeed if it were not possible that his gift had brought the robin just at the right moment when Colin asked that dangerous question. She felt that his magic was working all the afternoon and making Colin look like an entirely different boy. It did not seem possible that he could be the crazy creature who had screamed and beaten and bitten his pillow. Even his ivory whiteness seemed to change. The faint glow of color which had shone on his face and neck and hands when he first got inside the garden never really quite died away. He looked as if he were made of flesh instead of ivory or wax. Speaking of Rajas, we have been joined by the young lord of the manor, the Boofus. Oh, I'm in camera. When I take my drink, I'm gonna have to adjust that angle. Nobody needs to see my shoulder. They should be seeing the fire. They saw the robin carry food to his mate 2 or 3 times, and it was so suggestive of afternoon tea that Colin felt they must have some. Go and make one of the men servants bring in a basket to the rhododendron walk, and then you and Dickon can bring it here. It was an agreeable idea, easily carried out, and when the white cloth was spread upon the grass, with hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets, a delightfully hungry meal was eaten, and several birds on domestic errands paused to inquire what was going on and were led into investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and Shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake, and Soot took the entire half of a buttered crumpet into a corner and pecked at it and examined and turned it over, made hoarse remarks about it until he decided to swallow it all joyfully in one gulp. The afternoon was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lances, the bees were going home, and the birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting on the grass, the tea basket repacked, ready to be taken back to the house, and Colin was lying against his cushions with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead and his face looking quite a natural color. I don't want this afternoon to go, he said, but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you? Said Mary. I'm going to get nothing else, he said. I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself. That thou will, said Dickon. Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as other folk afore long. Colin flushed tremendously. Walk? Dig? Shall I? Dickon's glance at him was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was the matter with his legs. For sure thou will, he said stoutly. Thou's got legs of thine own, same as other folks. Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin's answer. Nothing really ails them, but they're so thin and weak, they shake so that I'm afraid to try to stand on them. Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. When thou stops being afraid, thou'lt stand on 'em, said Dickon with a renewed cheer, and thou'lt stop being afraid in a bit. I shall, said Colin, as he lay still as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything stills itself, and they really had had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg and dropped the gray film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of this stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper, "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. Man, they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the high wall. Look, just look. Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a bachelor and thou was a wench o' mine, I'd give thee a hidin'." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came toward him, he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much o' thee. I couldn't abide thee the first time I set eyes on thee, a scrawny, buttermilk-faced young besom, allus asking questions and poking thy nose where it wasna wanted. I never knowed how thou got so thick with me. If it hadn't been for the robin, drat him." "Ben Weatherstaff," called out Mary, finding her breath. She stood below him and called up to him with a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff, it was the robin who showed me the way." Then it did seem as if Ben really would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so outraged. "Tha young bad un," he called down at her, "layin' tha badness on a robin, not but what he's impotent enough for anything. Him showing thee the way? Him? Ah, the young nowt." She could see his next words burst out because he was overpowered by curiosity. "However in the world did thou get in?" "It was the robin who showed me the way," she protested. "He didn't know he was doing it, but he did, and I can't tell you from here while you're shaking your fist at me." He stopped shaking his fist very suddenly, and at that very moment, and his jaw actually dropped as he stared over her head at something he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if he were spellbound. But in the midst of it, he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there, wheel me quite close, and stop right in front of him." And this, if you please, this is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld, which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with a luxurious cushion and robes which came toward him looking rather like a sort of state coach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it, with royal command in his great black-rimmed eyes and a thin white hand extended haughtily toward him. And it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gulped a lump down in his throat and did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin still more imperiously. "Answer." Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a queer, shaky voice. "Who thou art? Aye, that I do, with thy mother's eyes staring out at me out of the face. Lord knows how thou come here, but thou'rt the poor cripple." Colin forgot he had ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet, and he sat bolt upright. "I'm not a cripple," he cried out furiously. "I'm not." "He is not," cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall in her fierce indignation. "He's not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked and there was none, nothing there." Ben Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again and gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hand shook and his mouth shook and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. Thou hasn't got a crooked back?" "No," shouted Colin. Thou hasn't got crooked legs?" quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much. The strength with which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in their existence which was revealed by Ben Weatherstaff's voice was more than the Rajah flesh and bone could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but this one moment and filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here," he shouted to Dickon, and he actually began to tear the coverings off of his lower limbs and disentangle himself. Come here this minute." Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. "He can do it, he can do it, he can do it, he can," She gabbled over to herself under her breath as fast as ever she could. There was a brief, fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed on the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall, his head thrown back and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me," he flung up at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me, you. You look at me." "He's as straight as I am," cried Dickon. "He's as straight as any lad in Yorkshire." What Ben Weatherstaff did, Mary thought queer beyond measure. He choked and gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled face as he struck his old hands together. "Ah," he burst forth, "the lies folks tells. Thou'rt as thin as a lath and white as a wraith, but there's not a knob on thee. Thou'lt make a mon yet, God bless thee." Dickon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not begun to falter. He stood straighter and straighter and looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. "I'm your master," he said, "when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare say a word about it. You get down from that ladder and go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you'll have to be in on the secret. Be quick." Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face was still wet with that one queer rush of tears. It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from the thin, straight Colin, standing on his feet with his head thrown back. "Eh, lad," he almost whispered. "Eh, my lad." And then, remembering himself, he suddenly touched his hat gardener fashion and said, yes, sir," and obediently disappeared as he descended down the ladder. Chapter 22. When the Sun Went Down. When his head was out of sight, Colin turned to Mary. "Go and meet him," he said, and Mary flew across the grass to the door under the ivy. Dickon was watching him with sharp eyes. There were scarlet spots on his cheeks, and he looked amazing, but he showed no signs of falling. "I can stand," he said, and his head was still held up, and he said it quite grandly. "I told thee thou could as soon as thou stopped being afraid," answered Dickon. "And thou stopped." "Yes, I've stopped," said Colin. Then suddenly he remembered something Mary had said. "Are you making magic?" "Oh, fire's trying to tell us it needs a little poking." It's a hot one this time. Well, I see my butt is still the star of the show. Y'all are just gonna have to put up with it till I'm done reading tonight. You never can trust a butt. They're always doing things behind your back. Colin was asking Dickon, "Are you making magic?" Dickon's curly mouth spread in a cheerful grin. "Thou's doing magic thysel," he said. "It's the same magic as made these here work out the earth," and he touched with his thick boot a clump of crocuses in the grass. Colin looked down at them. "Aye," he said slowly, "there couldn't be bigger magic than that, there couldn't be." He drew himself up straighter than ever. "I'm going to walk to that tree," he said, pointing to one a few feet away from him. "I'm going to be standing there when Weatherstaff comes here. I can rest against the tree if I like. When I want to sit down, I will sit down, but not before. Bring a rug from the chair." He walked to the tree, and though Dickon held his arm, he was wonderfully steady. When he stood against the tree trunk, it was not too plain that he supported himself against it, and he still held himself so straight that he looked tall. When Ben Weatherstaff came through the door in the wall, he saw him standing there, and he heard Mary muttering something under her breath. "What art saying?" he said, rather testily, because he did not want his attention diverted from the long, thin, straight boy figure and proud face. But she did not tell him. What she was saying was this: "You can do it. You can do it. I told you you could. You can do it. You can do it. You can." She was saying it to Colin because she wanted to make magic and keep him on his feet looking like that. She could not bear that he should give in before Ben Weatherstaff. He did not give in. She was uplifted by a sudden feeling that he looked quite beautiful in spite of his thinness. He fixed his eyes on Ben Weatherstaff in his funny, imperious way. "Look at me," he commanded. "Look at me all over. Am I a hunchback? Have I got crooked legs?" Ben Weatherstaff had not quite got over his emotion, but he had recovered a little and answered in his usual way. "Not tha," he said. "Nowt o' the sort. What thou been doing with thyself, hiding out and letting folk think thou was a cripple and half-witted?" "Half-witted?" said Colin angrily. "Who thought that?" "Lots of fools," said Ben. "The world's full of jackasses braying, and they never bray nowt but lies. What did thou shut thyself up for?" "Everyone thought I was going to die," said Colin shortly. "I'm not." And he said it with such decision, Ben Weatherstaff looked him over, up and down and up. "Tha die? Not o' the sort. Thou's got too much pluck in thee. When I seed thee put thy legs on the ground in such a hurry, I knowed thou was all right. Sit thee down on the rug a bit, young mester, and give me thy orders." There was a queer mixture of crabbed tenderness and shrewd understanding in his manner. Mary had poured out a speech as rapidly as she could as they had come down the long walk. The chief thing to be remembered, she had told him, was that Colin was getting well. Getting well. The garden was doing it. No one must let him remember about having humps and drying and dying. The Rajah condescended to seat himself on a rug under the tree. "What work do you do in the gardens, Weatherstaff?" he inquired. "Anything I'm told to do," answered old Ben. "I'm kept on by favor because she liked me." "She?" said Colin. "Thy mother," answered Ben Weatherstaff. "My mother?" said Colin, and he looked about him quietly. This was her garden, wasn't it? "Aye, it was that," and Ben Weatherstaff looked about him too. "She were main fond of it." "It is my garden now. I am fond of it. I shall come here every day," announced Colin. "But it is to be a secret. My orders are that no one is to know that we come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked and made it come alive. I shall send for you sometimes to help, but you must come when no one can see you." Ben Weatherstaff's face twisted itself in a dry old smile. "I've come here before when no one saw me," he said. "What?" exclaimed Colin. "When?" "The last time I was here," he said, rubbing his chin and looking round, "was about 2 years ago." "But no one has been in it for 10 years," cried Colin. "There was no door." "I'm no one," said old Ben dryly, "and I didn't come through the door. I come over the wall. The rheumatics held me back the last 2 years." "Tha come and did a bit of pruning," cried Dickon. "I couldn't make out how it had been done." "She was so fond of it, she was," said Ben Weatherstaff. "And she was such a pretty young thing. She says to me once, 'Ben, if I'm ever ill or I go away, you must take care of my roses.' When she did go away, the orders was no one ever to come nigh. But I come. Over the wall I come until the rheumatics stopped me. And I did a bit of work once a year. She'd gave her order first." "It wouldn't have been as wick as it is if thou hadn't done it," said Dickon. "I did wonder." "I'm glad you did it, Weatherstaff," said Colin. "You'll know how to keep it the secret." "Aye, I'll know, sir," answered Ben. "And it'll be easier for a man with rheumatics to come in the door." On the grass near the tree, Mary had dropped her trowel. Colin stretched out his hand and took it up. An odd expression came into his face, and he began to scratch at the earth. His thin hand was weak enough, but presently, as they watched him, Mary with quite breathless interest, he drove the end of the trowel into the soil and turned some over. "You can do it," said Mary to herself. "I tell you, you can." Dickon's round eyes were full of eager curiousness, but he said not a word. Ben Weatherstaff looked on with interested face. Colin persevered. After he had turned a few trowelfuls of soil, he spoke exultantly to Dickon in his best Yorkshire. "Tha said as tha'd have me walking about here same as other folk, and tha said that tha'd have me digging. I thought thou was just leeing to please me. This is only the first day, and I've walked, and here I am digging." Ben Weatherstaff's mouth fell open again when he heard him, but he ended by chuckling. That sounds as if tha'd get what's enough. Tha'rt a Yorkshire lad for sure, and tha'rt digging too. How'd thou like to plant a bit of something? I can get thee a rose in a pot." "Go and get it," said Colin, digging excitedly. "Quick, quick." It was done quickly enough indeed. Ben Weatherstaff went his way, forgetting rheumatics. Dickon took his spade and dug the hole deeper and wider than a new digger with thin white hands could make it. Mary slipped out to the run and bring back a watering can. When Dickon had deepened the hole, Colin went over, turning the soft earth over and over. He looked up at the sky, flushed and glowing with the strangely new exercise, slight as it was. "I want to do it before the sun goes quite down," he said. Mary thought that perhaps the sun held back a few minutes just on purpose. Ben Weatherstaff brought the rose in its pot from the greenhouse. He hobbled over the grass as fast as he could. He had begun to be excited, too. He knelt down by the hole and broke the pot from the mold. "Here, lad," he said, handing the plant to Colin. "Set it in the earth thyself, same as King does when he goes to a new place." The thin white hands shook a little, and Colin's flush grew deeper as he set the rose in the mold and held it while old Ben made firm the earth. It was filled in and pressed down and made steady. Mary was leaning forward on her hands and knees. Soot had flown down and marched forward to see what was being done. Nut and Shell chattered about it from a cherry tree. "It's planted," said Colin at last, "and the sun is only slipping over the edge. Help me up, Dickon. I want to be standing when it goes. That's part of the magic." And Dickon helped him, and the magic, or whatever it was, so gave him strength that when the sun did slip over the edge and end the strange, lovely afternoon for them, there he actually stood on his 2 feet, laughing. Chapter 23, Magic. Dr. Craven had been waiting some time at the house when they returned to it. He had indeed begun to wonder if it might not be wise to send someone out to explore the garden paths. When Colin was brought back to his room, the poor man looked him over seriously. "You should not have stayed so long," he said. "You must not overexert yourself." "I am not tired at all," said Colin. "It has made me well. Tomorrow I am going out in the morning as well as in the afternoon." "I am not sure that I can allow it," answered Dr. Craven. "I am afraid it would not be wise." "It would not be wise to try to stop me," said Colin quite seriously. "I am going." Even Mary had found out that one of Colin's chief peculiarities was that he did not know in the least what a rude little brute he was with his way of ordering people about. He had lived on a sort of desert island all his life, and as he had been the king of it, he had made his own manners and had no one to compare himself with. Mary had indeed been rather like him herself, and since she had been at Misselthwaite, had gradually discovered that her own manners had not been of the kind which is usual or popular. Having made this discovery, she naturally thought it of enough interest to communicate to Colin. So she sat and looked at him curiously for a few minutes after Dr. Craven had gone. She wanted to make him ask her why she was doing it, and, of course, she did. "What are you looking at me for?" he said. "I was thinking I'm rather sorry for Dr. Craven." "So am I," said Colin calmly, but not without an air of some satisfaction. "He won't get Misselthwaite at all now that I'm not going to die." "I'm sorry for him because that, of course, but I was thinking just then it must have been very horrid to have to be polite for 10 years to a boy who was always rude. I would never have done it." "Am I rude?" Colin inquired undisturbedly. "If you had been his own boy, and he had been a slapping sort of man," said Mary, "he might have slapped you." "But he daren't," said Colin. "No, he daren't," answered Mistress Mary, thinking the thing out quite without prejudice. "Nobody ever dared to do anything you didn't like, because you were going to die and things like that. You were such a poor thing." "But," Colin announced stubbornly, "I am not going to be a poor thing. I won't let people think I'm one. I stood on my feet this afternoon." "It is always having your own way that made you so queer," Mary went on, thinking aloud. Colin turned his head, frowning. "Am I queer?" he demanded. "Yes," answered Mary, "very. But you needn't be cross," she added impartially, "because so am I queer, and so is Ben Weatherstaff. But I am not as queer as I was before I began to like people, and before I found the garden." "I don't want to be queer," said Colin. "I am not going to be," and he frowned again with determination. He was a very proud boy. He lay thinking for a while, and then Mary saw his beautiful smile begin and gradually change his whole face. "I shall stop being queer," he said, "if I go every day to the garden. There is magic in there, good magic, you know, Mary. I'm sure there is." "So am I," said Mary. "Even if it isn't real magic, we can pretend it is. Something is there, something." "It's magic," said Mary, "but not black. It's as white as snow." They always called it magic, and indeed it seemed like it in the months that followed. The wonderful months, the radiant months, the amazing ones. Oh, the things which happened in that garden. If you have never had a garden, you cannot understand. And if you have had a garden, you will know that it would take a whole book to describe all that came to pass there. Time to poke the fire again, I think. I'll return in just a moment. Okay, I zoomed in the camera a little more. There should be less butt in future portions of this. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. I'm gonna try and just aim it this way just a little bit more. A little less shoulder. Oh yeah, that's good. I just gave it a little scooch. At first, it seemed that green things would never cease pushing their way through the earth, in the grass, in the beds, even in the crevices of the walls. Then the green things began to show buds, and the buds began to unfurl and show color, every shade of blue, every shade of purple, every tint and hue of crimson. In its happy days, flowers had been tucked away into every inch and hole and corner. Ben Weatherstaff had seen it done, and had himself scraped out mortar from between the bricks of the wall and made pockets of earth for lovely clinging things to grow on. Iris and white lilies rose out of the grass in sheaves, and the green alcoves filled themselves with amazing armies of the blue and white flower, lances of tall delphiniums or columbines or campanulas. She was main fond of them, she was, Ben Weatherstaff said. She liked them things as all as pointing up to the blue sky, she used to tell. Not as she was one of them as looked down on the earth, not her. She just loved it, but she said the blue sky allus looked so joyful. The seeds Dickon and Mary had planted grew as if fairies had tended them. Satiny poppies of all tints danced in the breeze by the score, gaily defying flowers which had lived in the garden for years, and which, it might be confessed, seemed rather to wonder how such new people had got there. And the roses, rising out of the grass, tangled round the sundial, wreathing tree trunks and hanging from their branches, climbing up the walls and spreading over them with long garlands, falling in cascades. They came alive day by day, hour by hour. Fair, fresh leaves and buds, tiny at first, but swelling and working magic until they burst and uncurled into cups of scent, delicately spilling themselves over their brims and filling the garden air. Colin saw it all, watching each change as it took place. Every morning he was brought out, and every hour of each day when it didn't rain, he spent in the garden. Even gray days pleased him. He would lie on the grass watching things growing, he said. If you watched long enough, he declared, you could see buds unsheath themselves. Also, you could make the acquaintance of strange, busy insect things, running about on various unknown but evidently serious errands, sometimes carrying tiny scraps of straw or feather or food, or climbing blades of grass as if they were trees from whose tops one could look out to explore the country. A mole throwing its mound at the end of its burrow, making its way out at last with the long-nailed paws which looked so like elfish hands, had absorbed him one whole morning. Ants' ways, beetles' ways, bees' ways, frogs' ways, birds' ways, plants' ways, gave him a new world to explore, and when Dickon revealed them all and added foxes' ways, otters' ways, ferrets' ways, squirrels' ways, and trout and water rats and badgers' ways, there was no end to the things to talk about and think over. And this was not half the magic. The fact that he had really once stood on his feet had set Colin thinking tremendously, and when Mary told him of the spells she had worked, he was excited and approved of it greatly. He talked of it constantly. Of course there must be lots of magic in the world, he said wisely one day, but people don't know what it is like or how to make it. Perhaps the beginning is just to say nice things are going to happen until you make them happen. I'm going to try an experiment. The next morning, when they went to the secret garden, he sent at once for Ben Weatherstaff. Ben came as quickly as he could and found the Rajah standing on his feet under a tree and looking very grand, but also very beautifully smiling. Good morning, Ben Weatherstaff, he said. I want you and Dickon and Miss Mary to stand in a row and listen to me, because I am going to tell you something very important." "Aye, aye, sir," answered Ben Weatherstaff, touching his forehead. One of the long-concealed charms of Ben Weatherstaff was that in his boyhood he had once run away to sea and made voyages, so he could reply like a sailor. "I am going to try a scientific experiment," explained the Rajah. "When I grow up, I am going to make great scientific discoveries, and I'm going to begin now with this experiment." "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben Weatherstaff promptly, though this was the first time he had ever heard of great scientific discoveries. It was the first time Mary had heard of them either, but even at this stage she had begun to realize that, queer as he was, Colin had read about a great many singular things, and was somehow a very convincing sort of boy. When he held up his hand and fixed his strange eyes on you, it seemed as if you believed him, almost in spite of yourself, though he was only 10 years old, going on 11. At this moment he was especially convincing, because he suddenly felt the fascination of actually making a sort of speech like a grown-up person. The great scientific discoveries I am going to make will be about magic. Magic is a great thing, and scarcely anyone knows anything about it except a few people in old books, and Mary a little, because she was born in India where there are fakirs. I believe Dickon knows some magic, but perhaps he doesn't know he knows it. He charms animals and people. I would never have let him come to see me if he had not been an animal charmer, which is a boy charmer too, because a boy is an animal. I am sure there is magic in everything, only we have not sense enough to get hold of it and make it do things for us, like electricity and horses and steam. This sounded so imposing that Ben Weatherstaff became quite excited and could not keep still. "Aye, aye, sir," he said, and began to stand quite upright. "When Mary found this garden, it looked quite dead," the orator proceeded. "Then something began pushing things up out of the soil and making things out of nothing. One day things weren't there, and another they were. I had never watched things before, and it made me feel very curious. Scientific people are always curious, and I am going to be scientific. I kept saying to myself, 'What is it? What is it? It's something. It can't be nothing. I don't know its name, so I call it magic.' I have never seen the sun rise, but Mary and Dickon have, and from what they tell me, I'm sure that it is magic too. Something pushes it up and draws it. Sometimes I've been in the garden, I've looked up through the trees at the sky, and I have had a strange feeling of being happy, as if something were pushing and drawing in my chest and making me breathe fast. Magic is always pushing and drawing and making things out of nothing. Everything is made out of magic. Leaves and trees, flowers and birds, badgers and foxes and squirrels and people. So it must be all around us, in this garden, in all the places. The magic in this garden has made me stand up and know I am going to live to be a man. I am going to make scientific experiment of trying to get some and put it in myself and make it push and draw me and make me strong. I don't know how to do it, but I think that if you keep thinking about it and calling it, perhaps it will come. Perhaps that is the first baby way to get it. When I was going to try to stand that first time, Mary kept saying to herself, as fast as she could, 'You can do it, you can do it.' And I did. I had to try myself at the same time, of course, but her magic helped me, and so did Dickens. Every morning and evening, and as often in the daytime as I can remember, I'm going to say, 'Magic is in me. Magic is making me well. I am going to be as strong as Dickon, as strong as Dickon.' And you must all do it too. That is my experiment. Will you help, Ben Weatherstaff?" "Aye, aye, sir," said Ben Weatherstaff. "Aye, aye." "If you keep doing it every day as regularly as soldiers go through drill, we shall see what will happen and find out if the experiment succeeds. You learn things by saying them over and over and thinking about them until they stay in your mind forever, and I think it will be the same with magic. If you keep calling it to come to you and help you, it will get to be a part of you, and it will stay and do things. I once heard an officer in India tell my mother that the fakirs who said words over and over thousands of times," said Mary. I've heard Jem Fettleworth's wife say the same thing over thousands of times. Calling Jem a drunken brute, said Ben Weatherstaff. Summat always comes of that, sure enough. He gave her a good hiding and went to the Blue Lion and got drunk as a lord. Colin drew his brows together and thought a few minutes. Then he cheered up. Well, you see, something did come of it. She used the wrong magic until she made him beat her. May I just interject as myself for a moment and tell you that this is an objectionable part of the story. And I do not believe that people make other people abuse them. So we'll just skip that paragraph. Ben Weatherstaff chuckled, and there was shrewd admiration in his little old eyes. Thou'rt a clever lad as well as a straight-legged one, Master Colin. Next time I see... Oh, God. Dickon had stood listening to the lecture, his round eyes shining with curious delight. Nut and Shell were on his shoulders, and he held a long-eared white rabbit in his arm and stroked it softly while it laid its ears along its back and enjoyed itself. Do you think the experiment will work? Colin asked him, wondering what he was thinking. He so often wondered what Dickon was thinking when he saw him looking at him or at one of his creatures with his happy wide smile. He smiled now, and his smile was wider than usual. Aye, he answered, that'll I do. It'll work same as the seeds do when the sun shines on 'em. It'll work for sure. Shall us begin it now? I'm going to poke that fire just a little more. The logs don't want to go where you want to put them.
It worked out though.
Yeah. I just need to give it a little more room to breathe, that's all. There we go. Oh, that's roaring much better now. Colin was delighted, and so was Mary. Fired by recollections of fakirs and devotees and illustrations, Colin suggested that they should all sit cross-legged under the tree which made a canopy. It will be like sitting in sort of a temple, said Colin. I'm rather tired and I want to sit down. Eh, said Dickon, thou mustn't begin by saying thou'rt tired. Thou might spoil the magic. Colin turned and looked at him into his innocent round eyes. That's true, he said slowly. I must only think of the magic. It all seemed most majestic and mysterious when they sat down in their circle. Ben Weatherstaff felt as if he had somehow been led into appearing at a prayer meeting. Ordinarily, he was very fixed in being what he called against prayer meetings. But this being the Rajah's affair, he did not resent it, and was indeed inclined to be gratified at being called upon to assist. Mistress Mary felt solemnly enraptured. Dickon held his rabbit in his arm, and perhaps he had made some charmer's signal no one heard, for when he sat down, cross-legged like the rest, the crow, the fox, the squirrels, and the lamb slowly drew near and made part of the circle, settling each into a place of rest as if of their own desire. "The creatures have come," said Colin gravely. "They want to help us." Colin really looked quite thoughtful, Mary thought. He held his head high as if he felt like a sort of priest, and his strange eyes had a wonderful look in them. The light shone on him through the tree canopy. "Now we will begin," he said. "Shall we sway backward and forward, Mary, as if we were dervishes?" "I can do no swaying backward and forward," said Ben Weatherstaff. "I've got the rheumatics." "The magic will take them away," said Colin in a high priest tone. "But we won't sway until it has done it. We will only chant." "I canna do no chanting," said Ben Weatherstaff, a trifle testily. "They turned me out of the church choir the only time I ever tried it." No one smiled. They were all too much in earnest. Colin's face was not even crossed by a shadow. He was thinking only of the magic. "Then I will chant," he said. And he began, looking like a strange boy spirit. "The sun is shining. The sun is shining. That is the magic. The flowers are growing. The roots are stirring. That is the magic. Being alive is the magic. Being strong is the magic. The magic is in me. The magic is in me. It is in me. It is in me. It's in every one of us. It's in Ben Weatherstaff's back. Magic, magic, come and help." He said it a great many times, not 1,000 times, but quite a goodly number. Mary listened entranced. She felt as if it were at once queer and beautiful, and she wanted him to go on and on. Ben Weatherstaff began to feel quite soothed into a sort of dream, which was quite agreeable. The humming of the bees in the blossoms mingled with the chanting voice, and drowsily melted into a doze. Dickon sat cross-legged with his rabbit asleep on his arm, and a hand resting on the lamb's back. Soot had pushed away a squirrel and huddled close to him on his shoulder. The gray film dropped over his eyes. At last Colin stopped. "Now I am going to walk round the garden," he announced. Ben Weatherstaff's head had just dropped forward, and he lifted it with a jerk. "You have been asleep," said Colin. "Nowt o' the sort," mumbled Ben. "The sermon was good enough, but I'm bound to get out afore the collection." He was not quite awake yet. "You're not in church," said Colin. "Not me," said Ben, straightening himself. "Who said I were? I heard every bit of it. You said the magic was in my back. The doctor calls it rheumatics." The Rajah waved his hand. "That was the wrong magic," he said. "You will get better. You have my permission to go to your work, but come back tomorrow." "I'd like to see thee walk round the garden," grunted Ben. It was not an unfriendly grunt, but it was a grunt. In fact, being a stubborn old party and not having entire faith in magic, he had made up his mind that if he were sent away, he would climb his ladder and look over the wall, so that he might be ready to hobble back if there were any stumbling. The Rajah did not object to his staying, and so the procession was formed. It really did look like a procession. Colin was at its head with Dickon on one side and Mary on the other. Ben Weatherstaff walked behind, and the creatures trailed after them. The lamb and the fox cub keeping close to Dickon, the white rabbit hopping along or stopping to nibble, and Soot following with the solemnity of a person who felt himself in charge. It was a procession which moved slowly, but with dignity. Every few yards it stopped to rest. Colin leaned on Dickon's arm, and privately Ben Weatherstaff kept a sharp lookout, but now and then Colin took his hand from its support and walked a few steps alone. His head was held up all the time, and he looked very grand. "The magic is in me," he kept saying. "The magic is making me strong. I can feel it. I can feel it." It seemed very certain that something was upholding and uplifting him. He sat on the seats in the alcoves, and once or twice he sat down on the grass, and several times he paused on the path and leaned on Dickon, but he would not give up until he had gone all the way around the garden. When he returned to the canopy tree, his cheeks were flushed, and he looked triumphant. "I did it! The magic work!" he cried. "That is my first scientific discovery." "What will Dr. Craven say?" broke out Mary. "He won't say anything," Colin answered, "because he will not be told. This is to be the biggest secret of all. No one is to know anything about it until I have grown so strong that I can walk and run like any other boy. I shall come here every day in my chair, and I shall be taken back in it. I won't have people whispering and asking questions, and I won't let my father hear about it until the experiment has quite succeeded. Then sometime when he comes back to Misselthwaite, I shall just walk into his study and say, 'Here I am. I am like any other boy. I am quite well, and I shall live to be a man. It has been done by scientific experiment.'" "He will think he is in a dream," cried Mary. "He won't believe his eyes." Colin flushed triumphantly. He had made himself believe that he was going to get well, which was really more than half the battle, if he had been aware of it. And the thought which stimulated him more than any other was this imagining what his father would look like when he saw that he had a son who was as straight and strong as other fathers' sons. One of his darkest miseries in the unhealthy, morbid past days had been his hatred of being a sickly, weak-backed boy whose father was afraid to look at him. "He'll be obliged to believe them," he said. "One of the things I'm going to do, after the magic works, and before I begin to make scientific discoveries, is to be an athlete." "We shall have to take thee to boxing in a week or so," said Ben Weatherstaff. "Thou'lt end up winning the belt and being champion prize fighter of all England." Colin fixed his eyes on him sternly. "Weatherstaff, that is disrespectful. You must not take liberties because you are in the secret. However much the magic works, I shall not be a prize fighter. I shall be a scientific discoverer." Ax pardon, sir," answered Ben, touching his forehead in salute. "I ought to have seen it wasn't a joking matter." But his eyes twinkled, and secretly he was immensely pleased. He really did not mind being snubbed, since the snubbing meant that the lad was gaining strength and spirit. Chapter 24. Let Them Laugh. The secret garden was not the only one Dickon worked in. Round the cottage on the moor there was a low piece of ground enclosed by a low wall of rough stones. Early in the morning and late in the fading twilight, and on all the days Colin and Mary did not see him, Dickon worked there planting or tending potatoes and cabbages, turnips and carrots and herbs for his mother. In the company of his creatures he did wonders there, and was never tired of doing them, it seemed. While he weeded or dug, he whistled or sang bits of Yorkshire moor songs, or talked to Soot or Captain or the brothers and sisters he had taught to help him. "We'd never get on as comfortable as we do," Mrs. Sowerby said, "if it wasn't for Dickon's garden. Anything will grow for him. His taters and cabbages is twice the size of anyone else, and they've got a flavor with them no one's has." When she found a moment to spare, she liked to go out and talk to him. After supper, there was still a long, clear twilight to work in, and that was her quiet time. She could sit upon the low, rough wall and look on and hear stories of the day. She loved this time. There were not only vegetables in this garden. Dickon had bought penny packages of flower seeds now and then, and sown bright, sweet-scented things among the gooseberry bushes and even cabbages, and he grew borders of mignonettes and pinks and pansies, and things whose seeds he could save year after year, or whose roots would bloom each spring and spread in time into fine clumps. The low wall was one of the prettiest things in Yorkshire, because he had tucked moorland foxglove and ferns and rockcress and hedgerow flowers into every crevice, until only here and there glimpses of the stones were to be seen. All a chap's got to do to make 'em thrive, Mother, he would say, is to be friends with 'em for sure. They're just like the creatures. If they're thirsty, give 'em drink, and if they're hungry, give 'em a bit of food. They want to live same as we do. If they died, I should feel as if I'd been a bad lad and somehow treated them heartless. It was in these twilight hours that Mrs. Sowerby heard of all of the things that happened at Misselthwaite Manor. At first, she was only told that Mester Colin had taken a fancy to going out in the grounds with Miss Mary, and that it was doing him good. But it was not long before it was agreed between the children that Dickon's mother might come into the secret. Somehow it was not doubted that she was safe for sure. So one beautiful still evening, Dickon told the whole story, with all the thrilling details of the buried key and the robin and the gray haze which had seemed like deadness, and the secret Mistress Mary had planned never to reveal, the coming of Dickon and how it had been told to him, the doubt of Master Colin, and the final drama of his introduction to the hidden domain, combined with the incident of Ben Weatherstaff's angry face peering over the wall, and Mester Colin's sudden, indignant strength, made Mrs. Sowerby's nice-looking face quite change color several times. "My word," she said, "it was a good thing that little lass came to the manor. It's been the making of her and the saving of him. Standing on his feet, and all us thinking he was a poor half-witted lad with not a straight bone in him." She asked a great many questions, and her blue eyes were full of deep thinking. "What do they make of it at the manor, him being so well and cheerful and never complaining?" she inquired. "They don't know what to make of it," answered Dickon. "Every day as comes round his face looks different. It's filling out and doesn't look so sharp, and the waxy color is going. But he has to do his bit of complaining," he said with a highly entertaining grin. "What for, in mercy's name?" asked Mrs. Sowerby. Dickon chuckled. "He does it to keep them from guessing what's happened. If the doctor knew he'd found out he could stand on his feet, he'd likely write and tell Mester Craven. Mester Colin's saving the secret to tell himself. He's going to practice his magic on his legs every day till his father comes back, and then he's going to march into his room and show him he's as straight as other lads. But him and Miss Mary thinks it's best plan to do a bit of groaning and fretting now and then to throw folk off the scent." Mrs. Sowerby was laughing a low, comfortable laugh long before he had finished his last sentence. "Eh," she said, "that pair's enjoying theirselves, I'll warrant. They'll get a good bit of acting out of it, and there's nothing children likes as much as play acting. Let's hear what they do, Dickon lad." Dickon stopped weeding and sat up on his heels to tell her. His eyes were twinkling with fun. "I'm going to poke that fire a little more." This cat sleeping on the iPad. He doesn't look like he is sad at all. He's like, "This is my spot." I can still see Chat sort of around his big arm.
My arm?
No, the cat.
Oh.
He's laying right on top of where I'm
Oh, I
supposed to be
see.
monitoring. All right, exciting times. We've got 83% read. I think we might be able to finish it tonight. It depends if my voice is going to hold out and how much filler text there is after the story, because I think there's like, some introductions or something of other books. That's what happens when you get free books. You get extra stuff in there. Mr. Colin is carried down to his chair every time he goes out, he explained, and he flies out at John the footman for not carrying him careful enough. He makes himself as helpless looking as he can, and he never lifts his head until we're out of sight of the house. He grunts and frets a good bit when he's being settled in his chair. Him and Miss Mary's both got to enjoying it, and when he groans and complains, she'll say, "Poor Colin, does it hurt you so much? Are you so weak as that? Poor Colin." But the trouble is that sometimes they can scarce keep themselves from bursting out laughing. When we get safe into the garden, they laugh until they've no breath left to laugh with. And they have to stuff their faces into Mr. Colin's cushions to keep the gardeners from hearing, if any of 'em's about. "The more they laugh, the better for 'em," said Mrs. Sowerby, still laughing herself. "Good, healthy child laughing's better than pills any day of the year. That pair'll plump up for sure." "They are plumping up," said Dickon. "That they're that hungry they don't know how to get enough to eat without making folks talk. Mr. Collins says if he keeps sending for more food, they won't believe he's an invalid at all. Miss Mary says she'll let him eat her share, but then he says if she goes hungry, she'll get thin and they both get fat at once." Mrs. Sowerby laughed so heartily at the revelation of this difficulty that she quite rocked backward and forward in her blue cloak, and Dickon laughed with her. "I'll tell thee what, lad," Mrs. Sowerby said when she could speak. "I've thought of a way to help 'em. When thou goes to 'em in the morning, thou shalt take a pail of good new milk, and I'll bake 'em a crusty cottage loaf or some buns with currants in 'em, same as you children like. Nothing so good as fresh milk and bread. Then they could take off the edge of their hunger while they were in the garden, and the fine food they get indoors would polish off the corners." "Eh, mother," said Dickon admiringly, "what a wonder thou art. Thou always sees a way out of things. They was quite in a pother yesterday. They didn't see how they was to manage without ordering up more food. They felt that empty inside. They're two young'uns growing fast, and health's coming back to both of 'em. Children like that feels like young wolves, and food's flesh and blood to 'em." Then she smiled Dickon's own curving smile. "Eh, but they're enjoying themselves for sure." She was quite right, the comfortable, wonderful mother creature, and she had never been more so than when she said their play-actin' would be their joy. Colin and Mary found it one of their most thrilling sources of entertainment. The idea of protecting themselves from suspicion had been unconsciously suggested to them first by the puzzled nurse and then by Dr. Craven himself. "Your appetite is improving very much, Master Colin," the nurse used to say. "You used to eat nothing, and so many things disagreed with you." "Nothing disagrees with me now," replied Colin, and then, seeing the nurse looking at him curiously, he suddenly remembered that perhaps he ought to appear too well just yet. "At least things don't so often disagree with me. It's the fresh air." "Perhaps it is," said the nurse, still looking at him with a mystified expression. "But I must talk to Dr. Craven about it." "How she stared at you," Mary said when she went away, "as if she thought there must be something to find out." "I won't have her finding out things," said Colin. "No one must begin to find out yet." When Dr. Craven came that morning, he seemed puzzled also. He asked a number of questions to Colin's great annoyance. "You stay out in the garden a great deal. Where do you go?" Colin put on his favorite air of dignified indifference to opinion. "I will not let anyone know where I go. I go to a place I like. Everyone has orders to keep out of the way. I won't be watched and stared at. You know that." Yeah, I think we need another log or two on there. That's what's going on. Now it's insulated. Those logs are going to make it burn way up. Let's see, Dr. Craven. You seem to be out all day, but I do not think it has done you harm. I do not think so. The nurse says that you eat much more than you have ever done before. Perhaps, said Colin, prompted by a sudden inspiration, perhaps it is an unnatural appetite. I do not think so, as your food seems to agree with you, said Dr. Craven. You are gaining flesh rapidly and your color is better. Perhaps I am bloated and feverish, said Colin, assuming a discouraging air of gloom. People who are not going to live are often different. Dr. Craven shook his head. He was holding Colin's wrist, and he pushed up his sleeve and felt his arm. You are not feverish, he said thoughtfully, and such flesh as you have gained is healthy. If you can keep this up, my boy, we need not talk of dying. Your father will be happy to hear of this remarkable improvement. I won't have him told, Colin broke forth fiercely. It will only disappoint him if I get worse again. And I may get worse this very night. I might have a raging fever. I feel as if I might be beginning to have one now. I won't have letters written to my father. I won't. You are making me angry, and you know that is bad for me. I feel hot already. I hate being written about and being talked over as much as I hate being stared at. Hush, my boy, Dr. Craven soothed him. Nothing shall be written without your permission. You are too sensitive about things. You must not undo the good which has been done. He said no more about writing to Dr. Craven, and when he saw the nurse, he privately warned her that such a possibility must not be mentioned to the patient. The boy is extraordinarily better. His advance seems almost abnormal, but of course he is doing now of his own free will what we could not make him do before. Still, he excites himself very easily, and nothing must be said to irritate him. Mary and Colin were much alarmed and talked together anxiously. From this time dated their play acting. I may be obliged to have a tantrum, said Colin regretfully. I don't want to have one, and I'm not miserable enough now to work myself into a big one. Perhaps I couldn't have one at all. That lump doesn't come in my throat now, and I keep thinking of nice things instead of horrible ones. But if they talk about writing to my father, I shall have to do something. He made up his mind to eat less, but unfortunately it was not possible to carry out this brilliant idea when he wakened every morning with an amazing appetite, and the table near his sofa was set with a breakfast of homemade bread and fresh butter, snow-white eggs, raspberry jam, and clotted cream. Mary had always breakfasted with him, and when they found themselves at the table, particularly if there were delicate slices of sizzling ham sending forth tempting odors from under a hot silver cover, they would look into each other's eyes in desperation. I think we shall have to eat it all this morning, Mary. Colin always ended by saying, we can send away some of the lunch, and a great deal of the dinner. But they never found they could send away anything, and the highly polished condition of the empty plates returned to the pantry awakened much comment. I do wish, Colin would say, I do wish the slices of ham were thicker, and one muffin is not enough for anyone. It's enough for a person who is going to die, answered Mary, when she first heard this, but it's not enough for a person who is going to live. I sometimes feel as if I could eat 3 when those nice fresh heather and gorse smells from the moor come pouring in at the open window. The morning that Dickon, after they had been enjoying themselves in the garden for about 2 hours, went behind a big rose bush and brought forth 2 tin pails and revealed that one was full of rich new milk with cream on the top of it, and that the other held cottage-made currant buns folded into a clean blue and white napkin, buns so carefully tucked away that they were still hot. There was a riot of surprised joyfulness. What a wonderful thing for Mrs. Sowerby to think of. What a kind, clever woman she must be. How good the buns were, and what delicious fresh milk. Magic is in her just as it is in Dickon, said Colin. It makes her think of ways to do things, nice things. She is a magic person. Tell her we are grateful, Dickon, extremely grateful. He was given to using rather grown up phrases at times. He enjoyed them. He liked this so much that he improved upon it. Tell her she has been most bounteous and our gratitude is extreme. Oh, I hate to do it when we're so close, but I cannot talk anymore. My poor voice is getting tired. It's been such a lovely time, but I'll make sure I have more story so that when next time we do fire with story time, I can start whatever